Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S. Japan Relations. Welcome to our seminar, last panel for the semester. We're going to have a discussion today about Japan, Germany, and Eurasia's security crisis. Now, honestly, Japan and Germany have been battling on the soccer field. And so for many of us, we are thinking about the soccer game that is going on as we speak. Last I checked, it was Japan-Croatia tied and going into overtime. But I am sure for those of us joining in the room or online, you are very dedicated to studying security issues and not just sports. Well, we have really important topics to discuss today. Japan and Germany are often being compared because of their past military aggression in the 20th century and their economic success and aversion to the use of force after the Second World War. But now recently, we see Japan and Germany are also showing similarities as they are increasing their national defense preparation and their cooperation with each other, particularly since Germany adopted a defense guideline in 2020 that was focused on the Indo-Pacific region. A month ago, there was a critical bilateral meeting of foreign and defense ministers, 2+2, between the leaders of Japan and Germany, at which they agreed to negotiate an agreement for the exchange of supplies and logistical support. In the background of these important developments are new security challenges. In recent decades, we have seen Northeast Asia facing new security threats: China's military modernization, tensions in the Taiwan Straits, North Korea's missile and nuclear capabilities growing rapidly. In light of these changes, Japan has strengthened its security alliance with the United States, and just recently, the Kishida administration proposed to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. Of course, the security crisis in Europe is even more dire and imminent after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and invasion of Ukraine this past year, causing human tragedy. This has raised questions about Germany's foreign policy, as well as its own decisions to accept deep energy dependence and trade dependence with Russia over the past 2 decades. Currently, Germany is spending 1.4% of GDP on defense. It has said there is a goal to reach the benchmark of 2% in 2031, but that point has drawn criticism, most vocally from the Trump administration, but ongoing from many US administrations. So this question about the development of increased defense expenditure in Germany and Japan and heightened bilateral cooperation between them as they both face new crises in their region leads us to want to consider what is the relationship and the prospect for Japan, Germany, and Eurasia's security crises. We're very fortunate to have with us 2 leading experts to help lead the discussion. Our first speaker is Masashi Murano, who is the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute and a project member at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. His research includes U.S.-Japan defense cooperation, nuclear conventional deterrence, and missile defense. For many years, he has been involved in research analysis, tabletop exercises for many strategic intelligence assessments and policy planning in the Japanese government. And in 2009, he received a Foreign Minister's Award from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. Today, he will be presenting on Japan's security policy. Our second speaker will be Professor Thomas Berger, who is Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies, Boston University. Professor Berger's area of expertise includes German and Japanese security policies, European East Asia security, post-colonial legacies, and US alliances. He is the author of War, Guilt, and World Politics After World War II, and also a second book, Cultures of Anti-Militarism, National Security in Germany and Japan. He has also published numerous articles and edited volumes, including in journals International Security, Review of International Studies, and German Politics. And today he will be discussing his latest research on German security policy. The seminar today is part of the special series on policy innovations and crises supported by a grant from the Japan Foundation. It is co-sponsored by the Minda Gunsberg Center for European Studies, the Harvard International Security Program, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to first announce briefly Actually, I think we have dispensed with Zoom etiquette because everyone is now familiar with the fact you will stay silent while our speakers give their 20-minute presentations, after which we will have time for question and answer where you can raise your hand in the room or raise your hand in Zoom. Thank you very much. Murano-san, please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction to Christina, and also thank you very much for inviting me to Harvard here. Yeah, so this is this is my first visit to Boston, so that I've been very much looking forward to the visit here. Also, both the Boston and Washington. I'm based in DC, but Boston and Washington have the great higher the educational and the research institutions, but I'm a part of some typical in the U.S. At the same time, that's a little bit rare in Japan. A member of some think tank community and working with both the U.S. and the Japanese governments in the very policy-oriented manner. And so today that the rule-based international order is being challenged by the nuclear-armed regional adversaries simultaneously. And these are Russia, North Korea, and China. So in this context, the challenges they're facing the US allies in East Asia, and including Japan, and US allies in Europe, including Germany. So that having both similarities and the differences. So I'm going to talk about from the U.S. Japan alliance perspective about these threats, what we face, and how the U.S. and Japanese governments' review of their strategic document and their force posture will affect the escalation dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. So since February of this year, there have been the daily news reports in Japan about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is because most of the Japanese are concerned about that the same kind of situation happened in the near future in Japan. So that is a kind of the mirror imaging of us. So in the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was often explained in the Japanese media that it was supplies, but I don't agree with it. So that is not a supplies. So because since invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Western strategic community has conducted a number of the tabletop exercises and policy simulations that have focused on some scenarios of the Russian re-invasion, the Eastern Europe, including Baltic states, with the nuclear blackmailing or actual limited nuclear use scenarios. So in addition, that intelligence assessment of the Russian force laydown since the end of the last year, and the timing of the start of the invasion had been almost exactly accurate. So of course, the attacks of some civilian targets and the nuclear blackmail are shocking, but it was not surprising for us. So in other words, that the problem is not the failure of to anticipate the invasion itself, but the failure to deter the invasion, even though that it was anticipated. So what is the cause of the failure to deter the invasion of Ukraine? So of course that there is no single factor. But it is hard to deny that the defense resources have been insufficient for a long time. In the case of the United States, the 2018 version, the Trump administration version national defense strategy has changed their US force sizing construct to one war standard after the determining of that it would be difficult to maintain the traditional two war standard in the age of the great power competition. So at this point, in the security community, expert community, a consensus was forming within the strategic communities that the priority should be in the Pacific, specifically China. So, but it is undeniable that the risk of the power vacuum in the European theater was underestimated at the cost of the US focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. So also US allies in Asia, including Japan, also that they essentially had welcomed the US concentration on the Indo-Pacific region. So in other words, Russian invasion to Ukraine is the result that was inevitable because of we have overlooked the reality of our shortage of the defense resources. So the Biden administration, the strategy documents which released a month ago, they also stated that China is the only competitor with both the intent and the capability to reshape the international order. The priority is given to the Indo-Pacific. So there is no change in the priorities. So I think that this is reasonable. However, the resource constraint has not been resolved yet. So according to some Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Kathleen Hicks, that the fiscal year 2023 version defense budget request is just up to 8% from last year. But it does not fully reflect of the inflation, so which is accurately almost flat or the decreasing from the actual comparison with the last year financial standard. So that as long as the resource constraint continue, that it is impossible for the United States to return to the two-war standard against China and Russia simultaneously. So nevertheless, that we face the multiple threats simultaneously. Now let us consider the nuclear armed regional challenges that Japan faces, or U.S. Japan Alliance faces, namely the North Korea and China's theory of victory. Okay, so that okay, just so it is okay. It is another big deal. So looking back to something basic to consider about the basic or fundamental geostrategic structure of Northeast Asia today. It's a kind of some legacy of the Korean War, and in 1950, it's happened to the 1950s. The Korean War began when the Kim Il-sung, the Kim Jong-un, the grandfather, invaded the South Korea. And in the early stage of the Korean War, the successful North Korean surprise attack that quickly pushed back the South Korea and US led the United Nations forces to the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula. To roll back this situation, the General MacArthur, the commander of the US United Nations forces, they planned the Incheon landing operation. So the UN forces were to assault the rear of the North Korea from the Incheon, it's the middle of the Korean Peninsula, and by the amphibious operations to cut off the North Korean logistical supply lines and to the sandwich to the North Korean forces between them, from the north and south. So this operation was a great success and provided an opportunity to the ROK and the United Nations forces to regain the lost ground. So the Battle of Incheon still holds many lessons for the South Korea, Japan, and the United States, and even North Korea. So that at the operation, at the inter-landing operations, a lot of the U.S. naval vessels and the joint task force departing from Sasebo, Nagasaki, and Yokosuka, and other major ports from Japan to support the inter-landing operation. And also that the some kind of the air interdiction operation in the Korean Peninsula, that those kind of operations, most of those kind of operations are based from Japan. It means that Japan, at that time, Japan was the extremely important role as the safe staging area. So that from North Korean perspective, conversely, that if it had not been for the US intervention and Japanese support, the victory in the Korean War would have been imminent. So those geostrategic relationship between Japan and the Korean Peninsula has not changed that dramatically. However, there is one major difference. That is that North Korean can now prevent Japan from helping the United States and the South Korea by the psychological intimidation or physical obstruction by nuclear weapons and missiles. So indeed that the current US-ROK alliance has the advantage over the North Korean in terms of the conventional forces. So this is why North Korea is trying to offset its disadvantages in the conventional balance by means of the nuclear weapons and its missiles. And the US forces in South Korea, USFK, have about 30,000 troops in the peacetime. And without support from outside of the peninsula, it is difficult to them to fight a large-scale operations for the long time period. So the North Korea is trying to isolate the South Korea by cutting off Japan, and which is the staging area for the US logistical support from the Korean Peninsula with its nuclear weapons and missiles. So that is the North Korean theory of victory. So to prevent these risks that US provided to the extended deterrence, so it's so-called the nuclear umbrella to South Korea and Japan. However, the credibility of the US extended deterrence depends on the security of the US, the homeland itself. So this is because that if the US is ever threatened by the North Korea, the US will have to make the difficult decisions. Is it worth defending Tokyo or Seoul, even at the sacrifice New York or Washington? So this is one of the question at the Cold War. So that in order to confront with the US with these difficulties, the North Korea has developed a nuclear-tipped ICBM can reach the US homeland. And this geostrategic relationship between US and its Asian allies is basically the same as the case of the Taiwan crisis. China can expand its operations and its options for invading Taiwan. So if it is prevent US intervention by using its theater strike capabilities, known as the anti-access area denial capabilities. And it could be a traditional amphibious operation or the distant blockade campaign to overwhelm Taiwan's economy. So we have also conducted some research analysis, the PLA, the People Liberation Army theater strike capabilities, and which showed that the most of PLA bomber forces have the combat radius of 1,000 miles. It's approximately 1,600 kilometers. And the total payload, the medium-range missiles, it most concentrated at the 1,300 miles. It's approximately 2,000 kilometers. So it means that most of the 60% of the counter power projection capabilities against US is essentially a strike capability against Japan. So in short, that if some war or conflict happened at the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan Strait. So Japan will be like a Poland in the Russo-Ukrainian war at still continue. So to deal with their North Korean or Chinese, their red serial victory, with the nuclear and the missiles, we needed to develop our serial victory, which we call the blue serial victory. So the primary way to compensate for this capability gap is for the United States and its allies to expand their conventional forces or law enforcement capabilities, so that exactly that Japan's efforts to have their own long-range strike capabilities is a part of these efforts to fill in these gaps. However, that we are still facing some complex challenges. For one thing, all Chinese, even the North Korean, the missiles are mobile, and taking it impossible to completely neutralize these time-sensitive targets. It is a very difficult challenges because of the conventional cruise missiles are too slow, and conventional ballistic missiles are not accurate enough to destroy these amount of the mobile missiles. So in other words, the potential targets for Japan's long-range strike capabilities is not a Chinese mobile missile themselves. And we needed to make Chinese air bases the primary target to prevent them from gaining their air superiority surrounding eastern part of Japan or western part of Japan or surrounding the Taiwan. Now, this is because their strategic objective, Chinese strategic objective, the maritime superiority necessary to invade or blockade Taiwan's cannot be acquired without air superiority. But again, so this is not an easy job under the resource constraint. So among other things, that what we may face is the cross-regional hard choice over the nuclear issues. So for example, suppose that Russia is outnumbered in Ukraine and Putin attempts to regain their ground by the limited nuclear use in the current situation of the Ukraine. At that point, after some potential limited nuclear use scenario by Russia, after that, the Biden administration would have to choose between the retaliation with the nuclear weapons or conventional weapons. At that time, if U.S. chooses to avoid a nuclear escalation, but by decisively damaging the Black Sea Fleet or Kaliningrad or some sources of the Russian nuclear strike with conventional forces, I think that it will easily imagine that it will consume ever more or most of some U.S. stockpile of the conventional precision-guided munitions, such as JASSM, RARSM, Tomahawks, and air defense interceptors. So if 2 years from that situation, China or North Korea makes an opportunistic aggressions, the U.S. will face a shortage of the precision-guided munitions to deal with it. So in this situation, it may be us, not them, who have to make the decision for nuclear first use options to offset the weapon shortage of the conventional forces. So that the nuclear first use incentive arises when the side is usually overmatched in terms of conventional forces. So this means that the choice we think are rational at that moment may narrow to some option we can choose in the future. So that is one of the difficult situations we can expect it. So the facing the multiple nuclear armed adversary simultaneously that may force us to make these hard choices, so that we needed to start to discussing about how to deal with those difficult issues. So that's the current situation, what we think about it. So I will stop here. I'm looking forward to a further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a frightening overview of the security crisis that we face.
I'll try to frighten from the other side. I also was originally asked to be a commentator on Murano-san's paper, and I have lots of notes already written here. Now I'm supposed to talk myself, so I'm kind of caught in between.
Thomas, would you mind coming up?
Oh, sure.
Or do you need?
No, I need my computer.
Right.
I wrote something out this time.
Oh, okay.
I decided not to wing it. I want to be a little bit more. So hopefully I won't drop anything and smash my already damaged computer. So look, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you. This is a familiar setting to me, and I kind of feel like I'm at home in some ways. I also see some people who I've been meeting recently in New York. We were all at a sort of Japanologist powwow at Columbia, and here I am again. So look, what I want to do today, and I'm going to try to be controlled. I had my phone because I want to run my 20 minutes, right? So I'm going to try to be controlled, and you help discipline me if need be. So I want to do three things. First of all, I have a personal relationship to this topic. And I want to say a couple of things about that because it has both intellectual and practical implications in terms of my analysis. Secondly, I want to briefly describe the German geostrategic situation. That is both its sort of historic geostrategic dilemmas and how Germany's been trying to deal with that. And then I want to talk about what's been happening on the other end of Eurasia. Because the Germans are, the impetus for me doing this, by the way, was I was in Germany this summer, Heidelberg. I had just been listening to German debates, and I was now focusing really on what was going on. The Chancellor Olaf Scholz made what was that time widely heralded as celebrated even as a historical speech, a historic speech on February 27th, where he declared that Germany has reached a Zeitenwende, a watershed moment in its security policy. And there was all kinds of excitement, and I wanted to study this. And then in the conclusion, I may touch, time permitting, and probably in question and answer, I want to touch on some of the practical implications for the US and for Japan, a little bit for IR of my analysis. Now, the personal angle, Germany, Japan, security crisis, nuclear buildups, promises that they will do more. It's all very familiar to me. I've heard this more than once in my life. Yogi Berra, the famous American baseball coach, famously said, "It's deja vu all over again." I started my career embarrassingly long ago. I don't even want to admit that I began working on this. I arrived in Tokyo, right? Nakasone, build up, still Prime Minister Yasuhiro, Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Germany, dealing with new Russian nuclear deployments, Russian and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan recently in our mind, Soviet influence in Nicaragua, Angola, Vietnam, Indochina expanding, big expectations that we're going to see a big shift in German and Japanese defense policy. And a lot was happening, in fact. We sometimes forget how much happened at that time. And I came to Germany and Japan with the expectation that we're going to do more. I was a good realist. I believe that the balance of power drives international relations. I believe that countries respond in predictable ways to potential threats. We were trying to tease out the ways in which that worked. And I came there and I expected Germany and Japan to begin to translate some of their very significant, in those days, we all thought, the phrase at the end of the Cold War is, the Cold War is over and Germany and Japan have won because of their rising economic power. We are fully expecting that Germany and Japan were going to do more. As I was doing my research, I had the embarrassment of watching the international system shift twice more in the space of a few years. First, Gorbachev, that's good, from my point of view, came up and seemed to diffuse the end of the Cold War, reaching out to President Ronald Reagan, to the West, and launching this extraordinary end of the East-West confrontation, at least so it looked. And then, just a couple years later, the Soviet Imperium collapsed altogether. And at that point, there was an article, and by the way, I'm sort of writing an article. I wanted to present it to you, but I'm just not able to finish it yet. There's a lot of material. John Mearsheimer, who's again in the news, deja vu all over again, professor of international relations at the University of Chicago, and perhaps one of the most prominent realist voices in American academia. But back in 1991, I have to look it up again, I have it here. He wrote an article called Back to the Future, Europe's coming as geostrategic instability. And the basic point is that, you know, the Cold War is over, the disciplining effect of the Soviet threat is disappearing. The United States is likely to withdraw from Europe and Asia. Germany, Japan, other powers are going to step up. We're going to have a multipolar world, right? And the key is that we actually have to make it stable. And so his suggestion was that in Europe, at least, it's probably the same is true for Japan, we should give Japan and Germany nuclear weapons so that there's a stable nuclear deterrent. By that point in time, I realized this was crazy. It was very logical. This was very, very persuasive to a lot of people. John Mearsheimer actually was on the cover of Time magazine. I was trying to put together slideshows briefly yesterday. I gave up, but you know, I was looking for that cover. But you know, there he was. He was invited to the State Department. It seemed very persuasive. But what I came to the conclusion here, I have to do my confession, right? This personal story is also, I have to admit my biases. Because what I wrote at that time is no, Germany and Japan are not at all willing to take on that kind of role. This just flies in the face of reality as the Germans and Japanese see it. Yeah, I mean, the idea of Germany and Japan getting nuclear weapons, or for that matter, taking on a major military role, becoming great powers, in the way that, let's say, France, even in a limited way, the way France and United Kingdom, which, by the way, later on, other friends of mine, like Mike Green, people who I know and admire, like Dick Armitage, suggested, you know, United Kingdom as a model for Japan. Again, not very realistic, given how the Japanese understand themselves and how they understand their environment. Likewise, the same with Germany. So I believe that there was a kind of strategic culture, that there are certain ideas which become implemented or institutionalized in societies, in political systems, and those have long-lasting impact. And I made that argument, and at least from the point of view of up to recently, thank you very much, research subjects. I have lots of research subjects in this room. You have been very cooperative with me in the sense that, you know, Germany and Japan have done a lot more. There have been a big evolution, more on the German side than the Japanese side. But, you know, overall, it seemed to hold up. Now we're seeing some big shifts again. And I do think we're seeing some important shifts. But my guess is, and so the article I'm writing is titled Back to the Future After All, ? And with regard to Germany, I think the answer is Japan is different, and I haven't thought it through. I was just in Germany, right? I have to go to Japan this summer. But with regard to Germany, my expectation is that they are going back to the future, but that is, they're going back to a pattern which we saw in the past, but it's going to look much more like the pattern of German security policy in the 1980s than it does, you know, German policy before, let's say, 1910, which is what Mearsheimer had suggested. So now let me just say a few words about Germany and what and so just basically, so now I have to admit, I may be wrong. I'm wrong all the time. My children tell me that, and I believe them. I am wrong intellectually. I've made lots of mistakes. But I suspect that there is more continuity than some people think, and for reasons which I think are familiar. Now, what I want to say, now this has intellectual stakes for international relations theory. I'm making a thin constructivist argument for those of you who care. I think there are also some practical implications, both for the US foreign policy, and I also think that there are lessons that both Germany and Japan can learn from each other, because in some places, to use another title from the 1980s, there's a little bit of changing places. That is, there are some interesting similarities now between the German situation and Japan's in the 1980s and Japan's situation in Germany, because Japan has now moved much more to the front lines. And I think that has some important implications that we have to think about. There are also some other points. Now, let me just say quickly about Germany. I'm not going to go into this too long. I already see I've talked for over 10 minutes, so you're going to have to tell me to shut up, Shin. But I think there's certain key elements that Germany, one needs to understand. Those of you who study German history might know that often talked about the German problem in Europe. That is, Germany is a country, 82 million, has a GDP of, depending on how you measure it, about 4.5 trillion. That makes it much smaller than China, much smaller than Japan, significantly smaller than Japan. But in the European context, it has been his, and this has been, if you look over time, by the way, I did a little bit of this in the article, it's kind of static. Germany's relative superiority to any one of its neighbors has been pretty static for a long time in these sort of raw power measures. It is significantly more powerful than the United Kingdom, potentially, significantly more powerful than France. And in some ways, the problem that the German problem that historians have referred to is that Germany in some ways is too big to be contained easily by Europe, but too small to dominate it. And that's true today. Some interesting stories by way of Angela Merkel talking to China, trying to say, you know, we've learned to be big. China needs to learn to be big. And Xi Jinping apparently told her the opposite. He said, yes, we've learned it's important when you're big, everybody's out to get you. So you have to be tough. So a totally different lesson, but the Germans have, that's one element. And then there are two other elements which further complicate the German situation. One is they're in the middle of Europe. They have borders with 9 other countries. So they're very exposed, and the others, they're economically extremely dependent. I mean, I was again looking at the statistics, about 80% of German economy is composed of trade, exports and imports. They're really, and energy, of course, is a particularly strong element. So the Germans have this particular problem, and that has been true for a long time. Now, how they deal with that problem has changed, obviously, over time. And basically what has come into place over and has evolved, but over the course of the Cold War were 4 key elements, I would say post-Cold War as well. First of all, a reflexive multilateralism. That is, the Germans have almost never met a multilateral institution that they don't like and want to join. They just feel that they need to join clubs. They want to deal with international relations through multilateral frameworks as a way of both channeling German power, making it acceptable to their neighbors, and also to appease German public opinion. Keine Alleingänge, no individual Germany zooming off and doing its own thing. Secondly, there is a deep reluctance to use force for similar reasons. The Germans, like the Japanese, not as much. The Germans do more militarily than you do. You know, German troops have gone overseas on combat missions. German troops have fought and died since 1990, a little bit over about 100. I looked at the statistic, I don't have it here, I wrote it down someplace, but about 120 German troops have died in overseas operations, and they kill people. I mean, they do this. Compared to Japan, I remember talking to some of my friends, I asked, what's a successful overseas mission? And the answer was, and I was surprised, one with 0 Japanese casualties. 0. I was quite stunned by this. A second element is that they have a military. That military is understood primarily in terms of that multilateral framework. It is always justified and seen as a tool for engaging with its partners and potential enemies. Germany must live up to its expectations. And yeah, to an extraordinary degree, the German armed forces are, in terms of planning and operations, are tied into NATO and they potentially other multilateral frameworks. And then the fourth element, and this is one that I think is especially of interest to you, is that the Germans have a policy of trying to engage potential enemies. This keeping open a dialogue since the 1970s, really the 1960s, has been a key element of German strategy. Even as you defend yourself and you deter vis-a-vis a potential enemy. Soviet Union was a very powerful potential enemy. And Russia, of course, doesn't have those kinds of capabilities in the conventional sense. It still has a hell of a lot of nuclear weapons. In addition to the 1,650 nuclear weapons or so that are there for strategic use, let's not forget they have over 2,000 nuclear warheads available for tactical operations. So, you know, Russia is still quite a problem. So, you know, the Germans believe it is important to try to deter your enemy in a multilateral framework, and at the same time, keep open the possibility for dialogue. By the way, my first job after college, I was working for a journal called the Washington Quarterly down in DC, Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the first, I was in the editorial office, and the first article I was dealing with, one of the first articles, was about US complaints and problems with Germany getting gas and oil exports from Russia. The Germans started this in the 1980s. It's not like this developed. Sometimes when you read the news, this was all from the last few years. Now, the security environment changed dramatically. The Germans adjusted with it. I'm not going to go too long about it, but the Germans reduced the armed forces. There were about 500,000 German troops at the end of the Cold War. For a brief while, it went up to over 700,000 when they brought in the East German army. They had a draft, so they could mobilize 2 million troops. Yeah, within a month, they could have an army of 2.5 million during the Cold War. They cut the budget, readiness budget, enormously. They cannibalized it in part in order to do overseas operations. So right now, and I'm not going to go into the statistics, I mean, it is shocking how unprepared the German military is. One of my colleagues, Jack Weinstein, Air Force general, he said it was scandalous when he was at the German Air Force bases. One little statistic I'll simply mention is, when you take a look, how many of the Germans have about 289 Leopard tanks, which are probably the best tanks in the world. But how many of them are available and how many of them are actually deployable? When you take, the ones which are being repaired, upgraded, and, in condition to actually be used, it's less than half. Similar statistics for the numbers of German combat planes, the Tornadoes, the frigates are even worse. The Navy is in worse shape. It is deplorable, the state of the German military. The military has gone down to 182,000 troops. Their defense spending as a percentage of GDP was about 3.5%. During the 1980s, it's now about 1.5%. They've gone up again a little bit, but about 1.5%. And they're talking about pushing it up to 2%. It's going to be a stretch. But okay, in any case, the Germans have this military, it shifted. And what the big shift at the end of the Cold War was to try to participate, to support US military operations overseas in a demonstrative sense. And this is when you began to get the overseas missions. Now, let's fast forward to what's happening now. The Germans were in some ways sleepwalking through the last 10 years. And they were sleepwalking because there's a change. The fundamental change, which was what the title of this, is that we are seeing great power competition coming back, both in Europe and in Asia. And what's very disturbing is there's a connection between the Chinese and the Russians. They are encouraging each other. I don't need to tell this audience about that background. I was in Germany at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, which is a leading German foreign policy think tank, in 2012. And there were two interesting things at that time, because I was working on something else, but there were two interesting things I wanted to talk with my German interlocutors. One, I said, we had a special session, by the way. One day we're in the think tank where they say, let's think out of the box. And there's different people reporting on different possible issues that aren't on the radar screen. And the team from East Europe had just come back from the Baltic states and Poland. And they say the Poles and the Balts are telling us that Russia is really potentially dangerous, and they're worried about the Ukraine, and especially about the naval base at Sebastopol. And the head of the institute, Werner Pascha, said, "We talk too much with the East Europeans. They're paranoid about the Russians. They're completely unreasonable." Okay. Well, 2 years later, of course, we had the invasion of taking over of Crimea and the invasion of Eastern. And the other issue, there were lots of other funny things. I was talking to people in the German foreign ministry and defense ministry. I'm saying, US-Chinese relations are not so great. The China issue, Ma Jin-yu, looks a little bit better right now, but this could go south again. And if that happens, our planning is we're thinking about a blockade. How is Europe going to deal with that? I also was very nervous because I was using a Huawei router. I have friends in intelligence in the US, and they're saying, we don't use that stuff. And if the Germans are using this, this could become a problem. So I was telling my German, they didn't want to hear about this. Absolutely unready. Even after 2014, Angela Merkel continued to try to engage Russia. Part of also the Obama administration encouraged a particular position. We could argue about that. So, the Germans were ignoring this. They were all aware. I remember talking to people in the foreign ministry and defense ministry at that time, and in the policy community. Yes, we know we should increase defense spending. Yes, we know there are these problems. Ob wir die Leute mitbringen können, we can get everybody, right? I mean, there is definitely a question about whether they can bring the rest of the country. Well, 2022, right? We tried to, as Murano-san was pointing out, we were trying to discourage them. It happened. And it happened in a way that nobody anticipated. This large scale, it didn't even make sense from a military point of view. These objectives with this limited force, no sense at all. But they went ahead. And since then, we've had the developments that we've had. Now, the Germans, in addition to that, of course, and we have this situation with Taiwan. We have increasing tensions in Taiwan Straits. The North Koreans, we call them the gift that keeps on giving in Asian security policy, have drawn attention to themselves again. And the Germans are now trying to respond. Now, what have they actually done? Well, in terms of declaratory policy, it's quite impressive, right? We are going to now get the German military back in gear. We are going to jumpstart this with 100 billion euro special funds, Sondervermögen, for increasing the German forces, getting their Einsatzbereitschaft, their deployability, their combat readiness increase. Number of important decisions have been made, such as 10 billion euros for buying 35 US F-35s to replace the Tornadoes. A re-anticipation, this is of course what Murano-san is interested in. You need those F-35s to replace the Tornadoes in order to make the shared, this is one thing which I've been talking to you about, by the way, to make the nuclear sharing arrangements, because there are about 30 NATO nuclear warheads in German air bases, which are flown on German planes, but part of NATO, and those weapons can be given to Germany on short notice. You know, so that Germany would, in a minute, literally, I mean, within an hour, if the decision is made, could have its own 30 nuclear warhead, right? Deterrent force. This is how to deal with the problem of decoupling that Murano-san was talking about. This was also, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm now making a little bit of comment for Murano-san, but this is also, I think, the direction we would need to be going in if we get serious about nuclear strict defense of East Asia. And I'm sure you have a lot to say about that. So let's leave that there. So in any case, so a number of these projects, still nowhere near enough, 100 billion euros. Increased defense spending. We'll see how far they get. The German economy is now in a major crisis, and the public demands in an aging society with workforce limitations. How easy this is going to be, I don't know. But they're talking about it. Germany's for the first time supplying weapons to Krisengebiete, that is areas where there's actual military operations taking place. For a long time, that was simply forbidden. You don't send weapons. Again, certain parallels with Japan, into an area where there's combat taking place. It's like the metaphor that they always use is it's like pouring oil on fire. Now they've changed that, and now you're deploying not only weapons, but heavy weapons like the Panzerhaubitze, high quality, long-range artillery, missile systems, the Mars missile system, so forth. German troops are first time arming drones for combat missions. Again, long time a taboo in the German discourse. German troops are being deployed to Lithuania as part of a NATO battle group and as a tripwire for what to do if there is, right, to guarantee European and US NATO engagement if the Soviets were to, Russia, because the Soviets now getting old-fashioned, but if the Russians were to launch a military operation in the most vulnerable part of NATO, which is the Baltic states. It's enhancing its military presence in the Asia Pacific. The Germans now for the last few years, they've sent a frigate for military operations. They just recently sent planes to Australia, 14 Tornadoes, I believe it was. The Germans have imposed sanctions. Okay. Time to wrap up. Okay. Now, all of these important changes are quite interesting. However, they're limited. Are they going to go further? Well, in terms of public opinion, there's good news and bad news. The good news is the public supported the speech. There is a sense that there is a threat from Russia, excuse me. There's also considerable support for distancing yourself from China in the German public. The German public understands that this could develop. The German media is full of this. I'm reading German media a lot, that there could be an East Asian contingency, and the problems economically are very severe that they would need. The bad news is there's very little German appetite for doing much more than this. Really, they want to do the minimum. The notion that Germany should take a leading role extremely strong, and the sense of a potential threat and escalation is extremely large. German political parties, again, on the surface, similar situation, you have appearance of strong unity. The major opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union, in principle supports this issue. In fact, they say do more. The coalition partners, including very surprisingly the historically pacifist Green Party, are among the most eager to support Ukraine. But inside of the coalition, and this is before things get going, I think there's going to be more tough things happening. There is a lot of division over how to deal with this. And clearly Scholz is aware of these divisions and does not want Germany to take an active role. The essential elements of the German strategy, and also with regard to China, Scholz just visited Beijing. I can say more about that. There was a lot of criticism inside the German government, both from the ministries and from the parties, about how forthcoming he was with Xi Jinping. But clearly, he was willing to do this to get some, I think, fairly minor rhetorical commitments from the Chinese, and he wants to be a partner. So basically, the four elements which I talked about have evolved, but they're still essentially there. We have multilateral framework, we have a reluctance to use force, we have a willingness to engage and an eagerness to engage partial opponents. Okay, final lessons, which I will say, let me just say for Japan, because this is largely a Japan thing. First of all, I think you need to think about multilateralism as an important device for, to the extent that this is possible. East Asia is not Europe, but I do think you will find it useful also for your own public opinion if you are able to operate more in multilateral frameworks. This will be tricky. Second, and this is perhaps more important, there is a linking between European and Asian security, and it's growing. Some of my friends, like former Ambassador Togo Kazuhiko of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, he also was trying to convince me it's important to try to split Russia and China. I don't think that's possible. And I think, in fact, what we're seeing is the opposite. If you want you're going to need European cooperation for dealing, if not directly in the military sense, but in terms of dealing with the large strategic challenge of China, you're going to need European support in dealing with the Chinese challenge. Reaching out to Russia, and in some ways the Ukraine war, which complicates the Togo strategy, is actually good for you because it has having a disciplining effect on the strategic relationship. And then finally, and this is the last point I'll make, and then I'm going to shut up. And we're coming back to that future again. It's the importance of trying to square arms control and deterrence. You are now finding yourself in a German situation. And you are going to find it very difficult simultaneously because you will be pushed internally and externally to have to try to reach out to the People's Republic of China, even while you're competing with them and potentially even facing military crises with them. You will need to maintain deterrence. And there's always a tension between arms control, dialogue, and deterrence. The way the Europeans tried to deal with it in the context of NATO was the two-track position. And I've talked about this often, but I think you need to acknowledge and understand clearly this is, it's not rocket science, so to speak, but it is important to recognize that there is this tension. And every time you try to go in on one track, is increased deterrence, try to guarantee dialogue is going. Every time you increase dialogue, don't neglect and allow it to undermine, to the extent you can, deterrence. Okay, I've talked too long. I now feel old and wordy, garrulous old man, so I stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A nice call for deterrence and diplomacy as two tracks. And I hope that we can work out some ideas for new strategies here in the conversation. So I want to turn quickly to our associate, Takahiro Omori, who is the Sankei Shimbun journalist, spending a year at Harvard as a program on U.S. Japan Relations associate, while he's doing research on U.S. perspectives on Japanese suicide attacks to end World War II. Omori-san.
Thank you for fascinating lecture. So according to Professor Murano's conclusion, and also according to Professor Berger's point that history is danger. So there is a possibility that we might face nuclear attack. So my question is about nuclear sharing. Before I came here, so it was this April or May, I talked with a young representative. He said that he would like to make studying group that is considering nuclear sharing in his party. So I answered that, let me know if your action will be concrete plan. So I'm going to write the article. However, over 6 months later, he cannot do that till now. So probably, I guess it is too hard, even if just a discussion. So this is my question. How German government got over some obstacles when they took a nuclear sharing policy? And in Japan, what do you think is the possibility or effect of nuclear sharing?
Murano-san, you want to go or shall I?
Yes, thank you very much for that questions about the, exactly that you maybe already know that I'm also focused on those issues. That this issue is how does affect on the nuclear sharing experience from Europe to Japan. At first, so when this discussion, I've facing those kind of, I've always been asked those kind of questions many of times from not only Japanese but also some other the U.S. counterparts for other or some other peoples. At that time, I've always asked the same things. What does the nuclear sharing means or NATO-like means? So the nuclear sharing arrangement in Europe or in NATO, that's very specific have been established by some exclusively specific strategic context during the Cold War situations. And also one is that those kind of the historical situation. The other aspect is the difference of the geographic or geostrategic environment, which means that in Europe there is the land-based theater, but in Asia, basically it can be said that the maritime-based theater. Another element is that how to compare with that the conventional. That our adversary's conventional precision strike capability, which I mentioned, the A2AD or anti-accelerated denial capabilities. So that in case of Asia, especially when we focusing on how to counter the China or North Korea and their nuclear blackmail scenarios, I think that when we considering their precision, their North Korean and the Chinese precision theater strike capability to the Japanese soil, the ground-based option, like a introduction of the Pershing II in Germany, Western Germany, or introduction of the gravity nuclear bomb, like a B-61 with dual capable aircraft. Now is Tornado, or in the near future, it's replaced with the F-35A, as U.S. described. Even, yes, the stealth fighters is the very effective asset to some conventional campaigning. But at the same time, when we're considering the risk of the crisis stability and those kind of escalation risks, from the adversary's perspective, to prevent the potential nuclear strike using by those stealth dual-capable aircrafts, the most highest possibility to neutralize those threats, to destroy it on the ground, because of the even that those kind of aerial assets is very effective to penetrate the adversary's air defense systems, but most of the 80% of the day that those stealth fighters stationed on the ground. So so what I mean by this is very vulnerable on the ground. So what I mean by this is that from our adversary's perspective, if some crisis or tensions rises, some first strike incentive to destroying the stealth capable aircraft neutralized on the ground. So that I think that those BCA based or aircraft based or ground based nuclear sharing option is not feasible for Japan. But at the same time, according to the Biden administration, the nuclear posture review emphasizing on the importance of the updating of our consultation mechanism. With the more deeper consultation or high level consultation with the ministerial level or the prime minister or the presidential level to involve or to give some mandates to Japan's or South Korea to more involved, more deeper consultation mechanism, not only just the prior consultation, but also actual the operational planning, conventional and the nuclear, the integrated planning mechanism. I think that those software solutions could be more feasible and important to how to maintain the credibility of the extended deterrence, but also at the same time for the deterrence elements, but also the assurance perspective. So that's my kind of sort of it.
Well, I'm in awe of Murano-san's technical expertise in this issue. Again, sort of reflecting my age, I'll tell you a story. When I was studying at MIT, one of my teachers was William Kaufman, who had been a nuclear defense planner with McNamara. And he told us the story that this is a true story, that McNamara was being asked in Congress, how many nuclear weapons we need to deter the Soviet Union. And he said, well, we need about 400 deliverable megatons. Okay. And afterwards, Kaufman and the rest of the staff went up to McNamara and said, Mr. Secretary, where did you get this number from? We don't have any calculations on this. And McNamara answered, simple. That's how much I got right now. The Russians seem deterred. Okay? We don't know. We really don't know in this world of looking glass mirrors how much is going to be take to deter. And if they, by the way, we could, as much as we want, and as we can see, when we've got an irrational actor, they're going to go ahead and do what they're going to do, not or badly miscalculated. I'm not going to say Putin's irrational; he just badly miscalculated. So this is both reassuring and deeply disturbing. Now, Japan has a recessed nuclear capability, and has it for a long time. The question is, how much do we need to bring it forward in order to signal? It's all about signal. We're sending signals to DPRK. We're sending signals to China. We're sending signals to Russia. We're sending signals to also other people. There's an intra-alliance element to this too. You're sending signals to us when you tell us, we could build what the Ozawa said. We could have 1,000 nuclear warheads using the stored plutonium anytime we want, right? So the question is, what do you need to do? There are many tools for this. Very famously, famously, not that famously, but for a long time it wasn't known. But back in the early 80s, Armitage visited Japan to talk with Nakasone and said, why don't we equip F-16s with some carrying devices so we can deploy nuclear weapons and we can fire, we're not giving you nuclear weapons, but we will give you that equipment and you practice using them and you can hit Vladivostok and other Soviet targets in the Far East. And we know after the Cold War, during the Cold War, we were getting signals the Russians weren't happy with this. And after the Cold War, we had access to the archives and we talked to Russians and they said, yeah, we know all about this. And it greatly confused and increased our right? Complicated our defense plan. If we need to do this, we can go back to these discussions. And the real question is the 1991, was it 1991 when Bush ordered? So we used to carry nuclear weapons on our ships. By the way, we can give you weapons. We can send it special delivery if we want. The Russians actually did this during the 73 war. I mean, the Russians deliberately slowly sent a radioactive cargo during the Yom Kippur War from Sevastopol through Turkey so we could detect it, to let us know as the Egyptian army was being rolled back by the Israelis. They let us know that they were sending a nuclear warhead, or at least a radioactive cargo, to Egypt, right, where the Egyptians had Scud missiles, which were being commanded by Russian officers, and that they were thinking about in order to pressure us into it. So we can do all kinds of things. If we want to get serious, I think it's a 1991 decision. We used to keep nuclear warheads first on Okinawa. Okay, we got rid of that. Then we kept them on our ships, neither confirm nor deny. I think that will be the logical step, right? You have F-35s now. The South Koreans have 60 F-35s. We've allowed them to increase their missile range, right? They went from 180 to 800, and we lifted under Trump the payload limitations, so they now can carry weapons. The North Koreans will get the signal. And the more they push, the more we can take those kinds of steps. So I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. All the technical issues are tremendously important. I think about the political side. How do we signal to them that we've got these capabilities, that we're working with Japan, with South Korea, with Germany? And if you push us far enough, we'll go further with that. That's my answer.
Of course, alongside the signaling is the reaction to that. We all know the old security dilemma. And so the
Absolutely.
more you prepare to be strong and deter, you will also provoke them to arm more quickly and severely. And so when I hear talk about trying to prepare for counterstrike against Chinese air bases, one can imagine as soon as anything happens like that on the Japanese side, that there will be dramatic responses. And so each of these steps, it is, as you say, it's about politics of perception and signaling. And so I want to bring in a question. We have a couple online. And so I think I'm going to take a couple of the online questions in our room and then let you both have a few closing remarks. So we have from our Asia Center fellow, Yaina Kwan, a great question about Prime Minister Kishida has said that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. Japan and South Korea are among the few Asian countries condemning the Ukraine war and joining international sanctions. Do you think the international solidarity in Asia against the war will grow? What is your take on Japanese and South Korean energy reliance on Russia? Okay, that's actually two questions, but they're both good. Hold your answer. Larry Gore asks, for Professor Berger about French President Macron's comments about how Germany is isolating itself in Europe and all of the tensions between Germany and Eastern Europe as they see Germany as the weak link in the Western alliance. Would you agree with that assessment? And what do you think is the reason for Germany's reluctance to lead after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I'd like to get one more from our audience here.
Hi, my name is Edwin. I work over at the Belfer Center, the Kennedy School. I'd like to go back to something that you mentioned, Professor Davis, which is the reaction, the security dilemma reaction. I'm a little bit fuzzy on my Cold War history, but my recollection is that the Soviet Union reacted quite strongly to the possibility that we would transfer nuclear weapons to West Germany. And there were a series of crises over Berlin. Some people think the Cuban Missile Crisis was connected to the crisis in Berlin. And I think that in the Japanese context, we ought to take quite seriously the fact that China might respond much more strongly than we would think. I'd like to hear a comment on that.
Great. I'm going to let Professor Berger start off so that
People have us on the chat. I'm just talking too much. You got to keep me under control.
Well, so I'm not an expert of the energy security issues, so that I don't have some clear answer of that, how to deal with the energy reliance to the Russia. But I think that personally, that is not a major part of it, just a marginal issue, so that it can be to manage of that, how to deal with that through the Russian sanction. The question about the reactions and the security dilemma situation when Japan decided to more seriously to upgrade our long-range strike capabilities. I think that I'm not a big fan of the security dilemma apply of the situation of the East Asia security environment. Because of the looking back to the 70s 2 decades, most of it is true that Japan's defense spending almost flat or even decreasing of these 2 decades after the since the second Abe administrations, even though that China is still keeping up their military buildup. So in that context, that the Chinese their aggressive behavior does not link of the Japan's defense buildup. So that I think that it is not appropriate to apply of the security dilemma situations. Also, so that in that reasons, the window of opportunity is already has been opening from their side. So that the Japan's own long-range strike capability is the option to close those windows of the opportunity, not to the cause of the further escalation dynamics of in this stability of this region. So that's of course that it is more importantly, it is a similar answer of that how to deal with the nuclear sharing issues in Japan. I'm not, I'm already focused. I'm focusing on the hardware issues. That weapon systems is important, but at the same time that the software, which means that how to apply of those weapon systems, the serial victories or concept of operations, or concept of how to deter some further escalation. That is more important. So that I think that's I believe that the coming up maybe that some couple of weeks later, the Japanese government will release some three strategic documents. So that I believe that the Japanese government to explain the role of our long-range strike capability, how to apply on those capabilities to our strategy.
Thank you. So there are a lot of questions.
Yeah, and we are close to the end of the time,
close to the end. So
if you would like responses.
well, in some ways, the first question, one of the first questions from was it Ina?
Yes.
And the Larry Gore question actually dovetailed together very nicely. I mean, question about solidarity with Ukraine. And what I was saying about German strategic culture, that is, there's this particular set of attitudes towards defense, and about Japanese strategic culture holds for everybody. It's not like they're peculiar. I mean, the US also has a particular strategic culture. That's actually an important thing I would talk to you about in a different context. But in East Asia, we're seeing certain continuities in patterns of behavior. India is historically very tied to Russia. They have concrete interests. They have also a deep-rooted notion of non-alignment. You can't expect them to take a big, strong stance on Ukraine. South Korea is peculiar because they are in such a vulnerable situation. They are trying to play both sides. I think if we pushed them hard enough, yes, they would wind up supporting us. Australia, I think, has actually been pretty, forthcoming. So it depends on the country. And each one of them, there's certain strategic logics, right, which are based on their understanding of their history and where they are, which is leading to certain kinds of outcomes which are not predictable but understandable and not surprising in many cases. In Europe, I mean, the Poles, when what Werner Pascha said about the Poles having a visceral and almost instinctive dislike for Russia, that's there. I mean, I could tell you jokes that the Poles tell themselves about, I'll tell you quickly one joke, but it's theirs. I mean, we're too serious today, but Polish soldiers being invaded, Poland's being invaded from the east and from the west, the Russian from the east and the German from the west. And the question is, who do you shoot first and why? And the answer is you shoot the German first on the business of principle before pleasure. You shoot the German because you have to. You shoot the Russian. It really makes you feel good. Now that's too brutal because it's a more, but there is a visceral response, and the Poles are going to blame the Germans for not doing more. The Poles do not like what the Germans have done in terms of the creating of the gas pipeline. They call it the new Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right, where the Germans and the Poles. So, you shouldn't be surprised. The French, again, my God, talk about strategic continuity. Macron sounds like he's, channeling the ghost of Charles de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle, in terms of talking about strategic autonomy and, Europe must stand on its own 2 feet, of course, being led by France. And the debates that you have between Scholz and Macron is a little bit like Adenauer and Scholz in some ways. I mean, they just, they agree, but essentially, the way yes, Germany is isolated. Everyone also finds it strategically useful to isolate the Germans in order to put pressure on them, precisely because the Germans have so much influence, especially in the economic sphere. They like to complain to the Germans in order to push them to do more. And the Germans are wise to that game too. But in the end, the French are not going to give up their special relationship with Germany. It's too deep. It's too strong. The Poles have problems with, and there's been a shift, by the way, historically. The Poles, right now it's not with the Kaczynski government, but in the end, they're not good. There's going to be tensions. Those tensions are inevitable. They are instrumentalized. Japan and Korea also have some instrumentalized tensions. It's not going to cause a breakdown in the relationship. In terms of the question that Evan asked from the Belfer Center, you're making a very good point. Our moves led to counter moves. And those counter moves, I don't think that, as the discussions that we had with the Germans about nuclear sharing in the 1950s, then Defense Minister Franz Josef Strauss was seriously thinking about a more overt German nuclear option. There was a discussion of a multilateral force for Europe, which was shelved at that point in time. I don't think that directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think there were other issues, the Berlin crisis. But in terms of the overall atmosphere, undoubtedly we were from the late 50s through to about 62, 63. We were in an increasingly tense phase. And it was pretty scary. I'm afraid we're going to go through that again. I'm afraid that things are going to get, to quote Marx, things are going to have to get worse before they get better. And I hope that we will have the wisdom, but it's not just up to us. I hope there's enough wisdom in Beijing and in Moscow for us to come to some kind of equilibrium. And we need to be ready for that. And that's precisely why I'm talking about the two-track decision type approach, because the tensions between the allies, the tensions within governments, and the tension between the government and the public as we're going through this, and we're going to be whipsawed. That is, we are going to be facing real fears of both sorts, better red than dead, and we better not sell out to the other side. We need to be prepared for that strategically and politically, and we need to do that. And we can't just do it by ourselves. The whole thing, by the way, Christine, the metaphors that we're learning, when you're doing this, it's like shadow boxing. The enemy moves like this, and you move like that, right? And you move your foot, but we don't just do it by ourselves. The problem is we have to do it together with our allies.
And the purpose of our panel was to talk about Eurasia, and so that's having this broader conversation
That's right,
about
and
the
we need to
theater
do it
in
more with Japan.
Asia and in Europe, and so this
It's
is
going to become more complicated because now we're in a second nuclear age. There are more nuclear powers, and there are more actors involved. And Japan becomes part of the conversation for Europe, and Europe becomes more of a conversation for East Asia. It's a challenge, but what else can we do?
Well, thank you. I am glad that we have experts like you to help us understand these issues. I hope some of the leaders and policymakers are also considering the deeper historical lessons in politics as well as the technical realities, because you really need to think of these problems from all perspectives. And as you say, all regions are connected. Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists first, Masashi Murano and Thomas Berger. Really fascinating discussion. Thank you all to our guests online and in person. And also thank you very much. We're fortunate to have Shin Fujihira and Molly Flash, our new assistant, helping us through our last seminar for this semester. And it's really been great to be able to bring people online and in person for a range of discussions over the term. I wish you all happy holidays and good December ahead. Thank you so much.